tonight we're doing Parshas Ki Tavo. If you're with me in the Stone Chumash, you can find it on page 1068, but any Chumash you may use, it's Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 26. And our Parsha begins with the subject of the Bikurim. So Kedarko Rav Moshe Alshikh begins with a series of questions, and actually his attention to this opening passage in our Parsha is thorough, extensive, multifaceted. It makes for fascinating Torah illumination, and as I like to do, I shall try to compress some of his most uplifting thoughts in the time that we have available to us. So the Torah begins when you enter the land that Hashem is giving you. So he observes that the word nosein is in the present tense. It doesn't say that God has given you, which would be sort of from the perspective of once you're there, or that Hashem will give you, which is from the perspective of Moshe speaking to the Jewish people, anticipating that they will enter the land. It doesn't do either of those, but rather it's in the present tense, as if God is still giving it to you, not only now, but year by year, because this is a yearly event. It says, V'yirishta, you shall inherit it, V'yashavta ba, rather, V'yirishta means you shall, it means you shall settle it, you shall really occupy it or dispossess the Canaanim v'yashavtam, you shall dwell and settle within there. The Torah then says in the immediate next pasuk, once you've settled in, there's a mitzvah that's a very important mitzvah. We'll soon see the importance of it. You shall take from the first of every fruit. Doesn't mean literally every fruit. It means the fruits of the land that are associated with the land of Israel, the special fruits of the land of Israel. That God is giving you, again in the present tense. You shall place it in a basket. Then you shall go to the place that God will choose to cause His name to dwell in that location. You shall come to the Kohen, and what follows then are a few verses which are very familiar to us. I'm sure you know why they're familiar. In other words, you recognize where they're from, but it's interesting because these verses serve as the basis of the Haggadah Shel Pesach, which we recite and analyze and recount and dwell upon and delight in every year. Twice a year if you live in the diaspora, 2 nights of Pesach. So the whole Haggadah is built around these psukim. The psukim that follow, you shall come to the Kohen and you shall make the declaration, Haggadati ayom l'Hashem Elokecha. I'm making this declaration today to the Lord your God, which is an interesting expression, because why doesn't he say the Lord our God or the Lord my God if he's speaking for himself on his own behalf? He addresses the Kohen and says, your God. Because I've come to the land that God has promised to give to us. He has really sworn to give. He's committed himself. And then the Kohen takes the basket from you, and then you make this famous declaration in verse 5. Now it's before the Lord your God. Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean, or the way it's rendered here in Art School according to Rashi, an Aramean sought to destroy my father, and he went down to Egypt, etc. So this is the account of the one who brings the Bikurim, the first fruits. Now I said that this is a very important mitzvah. So Alshikh actually begins his commentary with the following words. He says, someone who sees the dramatic, the trembling, the fervor, the ardor. The word charada is like an earthquake, or the trembling, the excitement. It's also the basis of the word charedi, which has become a fashionable word nowadays, that God attaches to this mitzvah of Bikurim, that the person has to bestir himself from his home and from his town. And he may not live in the suburb of Jerusalem. Not everybody lives in Har Nof or in Rechavia. Some people live in Beersheba. Some people live in Dan, in the north. A person has to harvest his crop, but he doesn't even take a substantial amount necessarily. Midrabanan, there's a certain proportion he should take for Bikurim. But Minhag Torah, even one cluster of grapes is enough for the whole vineyard. One pomegranate is enough for the whole orchard, one handful of olives is enough for his entire grove. And he walks himself. He says, and a small amount, a representative amount, a symbolic amount from the fruits with which the land of Israel is praised. And he says, even Agrippas HaMelech, even the king of Israel, is obligated to do it himself. He can't send an employee. He can't send one of his sharecroppers to do that mitzvah. He's got to do it himself. And they adorn the ox that, proceeds ahead of those farmers who are coming from throughout the land of Israel, and they adorn the horns of the ox with gold, and they use a special type of basket, and they sing, and they have musical accompaniment as well. And says the Alshikh, concluding that opening paragraph, Uma kol ha-Charada hazos. He's using a pun, kol ha-Charada, all of this excitement, but the word kol he spells with a kuf, meaning the voice, the sound. What is the sound of all of this trembling, all of this enthusiasm, excitement? Al pachos mishvei chatzi dinar. The whole thing is worth less than half a dinar. We would say in our terms like 5 pounds or something like that. What's it all about? Why all of the excitement? Then he quotes a famous comment which Rashi mentions in his first comment at the beginning of his commentary on the Torah. He says that the whole world was worth creating for the mitzvah of Bikurim, because it says, take a close look at the second pasuk. We read it already tonight. V'lakachta mereishis kol pri ha'adama. I see one of our friends is mentioning a photo of a celebration of Bikurim in the kibbutz. That's a great thing to do. If you have the merit of living in Israel, or even visiting there, or even working on a kibbutz, laboring in the hot sun, and you're cultivating the fruits of the land of Israel, and you can fulfill the mitzvah of Bikurim, even nowadays, in a symbolic way, kol ha-kavod. Take a look at the second book. It says Reishis. So the Medrash says, the Medrash Tanchuma says, Bereshis Rabbah says, Bishvil Bikurim, that's called Reishis. The Torah says, Bereshis Bar Elokim. So the Medrash says, for the mitzvah of Bikurim, which is called Reishis, God created the world. For the mitzvah of Bikurim. Ma gadla ha-mitzvah zo she'aleh levada nivra ha'olam. Says the Alshikh, we have to understand what is so special about this mitzvah, and why is it accompanied with such extraordinary enthusiasm and excitement. And why does the farmer have to go himself, even though he's bringing only a symbolic amount? He has to bring it to the Beis HaMikdash and make this declaration, as we have seen. So he says what many Mefarshim say. In fact, Rashi also says it's she'ein cha kafui tova. The purpose of this demonstration is to show that you do not take God's beneficence for granted. Eincha kafui tova. You don't deny God's benevolence. You don't take it for granted. And after a while, you think, hey, it's my hard work. It's my ingenuity. It's my timing of the planting of the crop, and etc., etc. And not only that, but the land itself. We conquered the land. I've settled the land. I've developed the land. This is my homestead. I worked hard on it. A person has to recognize, even though all of that may well be true, but he has to recognize the hand of God that underlies it all. Moreover, he says, this is the land Hashem gave you. That Hashem gave you, but it's in the present tense. God gives you, because the land by itself doesn't guarantee the yield of grapes or olives or pomegranates or figs or any of the yield. That is not a foregone conclusion. The land is flowing with milk and honey, but even so, that only shows the potential. The actualization depends on the efforts of the person and the ongoing blessing of Hashem. We're talking about an annual beneficence that God displays. A person, that's what it says, Ashanino, saying a person has to realize, the farmer has to realize that it comes from Hashem. And I have to tell you that in my experience, farmers tend to recognize that. I'm not a farmer, but I grew up in a small town called West Lafayette, Indiana. Some of you know that. My father was also not a farmer. He was a professor of microbiology, but Purdue University is surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of farmland. And the whole state of Indiana is primarily agrarian. And I became familiar a little bit with the rhythm of farmers. A farmer, by his nature, has an awareness of his reliance on forces beyond his control. Because ultimately, the weather, the rainfall, whether it's hot or cold at a reasonable time. Now, that variability in the land of Israel may not be so dramatic, but in Indiana, it is. The summers are hot, the winters are cold. But if the winter gets too warm and there's a thaw that's too early, and then it gets cold again, and all the plants that have started to bud or blossom can be damaged. I don't need to go into the details. That awareness of his dependence on the forces of nature makes the farmer conscious of his indebtedness to Hashem and his reliance on Hashem. The yield of the land every year is in doubt. He distinguishes between the word Yerusha, which is inheritance, and Matana, which is gift. The Torah says here, Asher anino sein v'hayaki Hashem nosein lecha, that God gives you nachala v'yirishta. He emphasizes, and later on, it says again, the gift, I've come to the land that God has given. He says that a gift can be conditional. Moreover, a gift can have a condition, which is that it goes to you, and after a certain period of time, it goes to someone else. A person can give a gift with any conditions that he wants to attach to the gift. Now, the recipient may decline the gift if the conditions are too onerous, but the nature of a gift is twofold. Firstly, one has to have gratitude to the giver. And secondly, one has to realize that the gift by its nature is not necessarily eternal. A Yerusha, an inheritance, is one who inherits something from a parent. So according to Torah law, the possessions of the parents go to the children according to certain regulations, and that is automatic. Now, it's possible for a person to plan, manage his estate and that sort of thing. But strictly speaking, when a man dies, his assets go to his children, and they go according to a certain law that the firstborn gets a double portion, the others get a single portion, and that is a definitive according to Torah law, and it is permanent. Says the Alshikh, that's where the Torah here emphasizes, this is a matana, this is a gift. So when it says Eincha kafui tova, you don't take God for granted. That's why year by year, the first of the crop, the first represents the most desirable, because after all, the man has labored months and months to awaiting the opportunity to harvest his crop. And when he does so, when the first grapes ripen on the vine, and when the first figs are ready for harvesting and consumption, of course, there's a sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of, my efforts have finally borne fruit in a literal way. That's why it says the first fruit he must bring to the Beis HaMikdash. There's more. He says that the person has to do it himself. V'lakachta, you have to take it. V'samta batena, you have to put it in the basket. V'halachta, you yourself have to make your way to Jerusalem. You can't outsource this. You can't hire someone else to do it on your behalf. Then he makes another very astute point. I asked, it wasn't my own idea, it was Alshikh drew my attention to the unusual turn of phrase. The farmer addresses the Kohen, and he says, Higadati hayom Lashem Elokecha. I am making a declaration today to the Lord your God. Says Alshikh, this man, he may have a feeling that this really is my crop, this really is my land, and he maybe feels a bit put out that he has to take some, the first, symbolically the best, and take it to Yerushalayim, that long journey. Maybe he feels as if really he's kind of put upon. He wants to get back and harvest the rest of the crop. That's why initially he doesn't say address God and says, Hashem, I'm grateful to you, because Hashem says, you know what? I'm not sure that I'm even prepared to accept your service yet. First speak to the Kohen. First address the Kohen. And you say to the Kohen, Higadati hayom uvasala Kohen, Higadati hayom Hashem Elokecha, because I've come to the land that God has promised our fathers to give to us. Now, in there also, even though the man says, look, God promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so I'm only cashing in on the promise. And it's not an act of a special kindness for God to give it to me, because he promised already Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's not so, because he could have given it to any generation. Alshikh has an extensive explanation of that. That's why the man reflects on going down to Egypt and that sort of thing, that it was specifically this generation, but I don't want to dwell on that because of shortness of time. But he says that that's why initially the man gives it to the Kohen, and he addresses the Kohen. Once he's done that, once he acknowledges his gratitude to Hashem and his debt, then he's allowed to address God directly. And then he's allowed to say, then he's permitted to say, the Kohen will take it from you and place it before the Mizbeach, for the altar, and then the man is allowed to respond. Then he's allowed to address God, so to speak, and formally and verbally recount the divine blessing and how his ancestors were few in number, and they went down to Egypt as a small, I guess a large extended family, but a small tribe, and there initially they were welcomed, but quickly they were persecuted, as again the story is very well known. So this is the account, and by so saying, the man is giving expression to the need to feel that indebtedness to Hashem. And he says, Arami Oved Avi, as we explained, that my father, that an Aramean sought to destroy my father. He actually explains some of the ha-Kadosh al Pesach here along the way, why we blame Lavan, the Aramean, although his name is not in the pasuk, but Arami, he would seem to be the Aramean, certainly according to Rashi and according to Targum Onkelos, he is the Aramean to which we make reference. And then you have to wonder, why does the man declare that an Aramean, meaning Lavan, sought to destroy my father, and we had to go down to Egypt as a result, because Lavan and going down to Egypt were apparently unrelated. Alshikh explains why that is, but we'll do that for a different time. This is how he explains why the world was worthwhile being created for Bikurim, because it's a way of our recognizing the Eibishter Fear the Veil, that Hashem runs the world, and all of my benefits and all of my accomplishments, and certainly the farmer in the land of Israel who has inherited an ancestral tract as his homestead, and he is able to cultivate it, and he brings the first fruits, he must acknowledge it comes from Hashem. And for that, in that sense, the world is worthy of being created for that important mitzvah. My friends, I want to share in the last second half of our shir this evening a completely different approach. Having expounded on this passage, as I say, at length and at breadth and in depth, Alshikh then takes a completely different tack, which he does in a few different places I've seen in his parish. Baruch Hashem, we've nearly completed the study of Alshikh al-HaTorah, and I've seen that certain passages, he explains them, and then he looks at it al derech remez, from a metaphorical standpoint, from an allegorical, probably is a better word, as an allegory. And he says, v'derech remez yomar, Hashem says to the soul of man, ki savo el haaretz, when you come to the land that Hashem is giving you nachala as an inheritance. What is that land? And why does the Torah begin? Why does this parasha begin with the word v'haya? Now you may know the Medrash says that the word vayehi is associated with misfortune, like it says vahi b'mei Achashverosh and other times vahi b'mei shvot hashoftim. V'haya is the opposite. V'haya is b'simcha. Haya suggests joy. V'haya kisvana. It's not surprising that it says v'haya kisavo, because it's talking about the first fruits. Says Alshikh, but I've got another suggestion, another approach. The Torah here is speaking is speaking in an allegorical vein to the soul of man. V'haya, with joy, when you come to the land, Eretz HaElyon, the next world, that God is giving you nachala as an inheritance. That's an inheritance which is not a temporary dwelling like this world. He says that not like Olam Hazeh, which is arai, which is only a temporary dwelling, but rather v'yirishta, you shall inherit it, v'yashavta ba, and you shall dwell in it. He says without an interruption, meaning your dwelling in the next world will be forevermore. You say, well, everybody knows that. Alshikh is not so sure. He says, what about Gilgul? What about coming back in reincarnation? A person who does not fulfill his purpose in this lifetime may be destined, may be compelled to return again, the Gilgul, as a reincarnation. He says that's why the Torah is talking here to a person, maybe a righteous person, and that person is said, Hashem says, when you come to the land and you settle in it and you inherit it and you dwell there via Shavta Ba permanently, you won't have to come down again. Then he says to the soul that he elaborates. I'm skipping a bit to get to the main part. Arami Oved Avi, which soul makes a declaration to God in the next world. Arami, the word Arami means an Aramean. Aram was one of the nations of Canaan. Arami Oved Avi. Maybe not one of the, no, not one of the, not one of the Canaanim, but in any case, Arami. An Aramean, the word Aramaic, the language Aramaic, it comes from the Fertile Crescent, really, from Mesopotamia in antiquity. Arami has the letters of Ramai. It's an anagram for Ramai. A Ramai is someone who is a fraudster, someone who is deceptive. So he says this is a reference to the Yetzer Hara. Arami, the cunning Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, sought to destroy my father. Now, actually, Alshikh doesn't say this, but I would understand my father to refer to my very first father, Adam Harishon, Adam, the first man. The Yetzer Hara plagued him and all of his progeny without exception. The Yetzer Hara has become an inescapable companion and adversary of every human being. So he says, Aramia, Ramai, the Yetzer Hara stalked me, sought to destroy me. Vayered Mitzrayim, and I went down to Mitzrayim. He says the word Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzar, like Min ha-Meitzar Karasiya, from the straits, from the confinement. Tsar is narrow. Tzadi Resh is narrow. Meitzarim. He says, when I emerged from my mother's womb, and that is a small opening, and like the pasuk says, Kila Pesach Chatas Rovetz. At the opening, the Yetzer Hara crouches. That's what Hashem said to Cain and Hevel when Cain was distressed. So Pesach Chatas Rovetz, that the sinful one, the one who entices man to sin, crouches at the opening of the womb. As soon as a person is born, the Yetzer Hara assails him. So he says that's the Vayered Mitzrayim. I went down and I entered the world through my mother's womb, and the Yetzer Hara was immediately my inescapable companion and adversary. And he says, V'nitzak el Hashem, I called out to God. It was only through heartfelt prayer, through the recognition that if God does not assist me, I can never be assured of, in any case, I can never be assured, but I can only successfully evade the clutches of the Yetzer Hara, the enticements and the urging of the Yetzer Hara, if God assists me. V'nitzak el Hashem, I called out to God, v'yatzileu, and God saved me from the Yetzer Hara. And therefore I have brought Reshis, and here he says a beautiful idea. Reshis Priha Adama. Priha Adama means the fruits of my efforts. I've brought Reshis, the first of them. So he says, what about the rest of my mitzvahs? I did a lot of mitzvahs in Olam Hazeh. I successfully eluded, at least some of the time or most of the time, the blandishments of the Yetzer Hara. I called out to Hashem and I overcame the Yetzer Hara with a lot of difficulty. I did a lot of mitzvahs, but you know what? I hardly get credit for them. Why? Because he says, I've only brought rashis. I only have it to my credit. Just the beginning, I tried to do mitzvahs, but once I tried, then Hashem enabled me to succeed. Habal taher Messiah. One who comes to purify himself is assisted min hashamayim, which means that I don't really get credit for the fulfillment of a mitzvah, because once I undertook to achieve the mitzvah, to embark upon the mitzvah, Hashem assisted me. So if Hashem assisted me, then I don't get that much credit, because really it was the divine, inspiration or that facilitated, that made it possible for me. So to that, Hashem says to him, don't worry. V'samachta b'chol hatov. You can rejoice in all of your achievements, even though it may be true that it was the initial effort that is most commendable. Because once a person gets into the groove, once he discovers the beauty and the sweetness of Torah and mitzvahs, so he wants to do them of his own accord. He doesn't have to struggle with the Yetzer Hara so much anymore, and Hashem assists him as well. That's true, but it's the initial decision. It's the initial effort. It's the initial commitment, and it doesn't just mean once in a person's life, or even one stage in his life. It's any mitzvah that a person comes to do. A person comes to daven, so he walks into shul, so that's an achievement. Once he's there, he is already assisted. The chazan is there, and the rabbi maybe is there, hopefully, and the friends are there, the environment is there. He puts on his tefillin, or a woman comes in to pray, especially in these upcoming days that approach us now, Yamim Noraim. We are assisted, we are enabled by the environment, by the surroundings, and hopefully we can concentrate on our prayers and our mitzvah observance. But it's the initial endeavor, it's the initial drive, the inertia that we generate of our own effort, for which we give the credit. That's rashis, that's the beginning. But he says, v'samachta b'chol hatov, ki gam asher rashis bilvad asisi, even though you've only done the beginning of it, that's you get credit for that. Tismach b'chol hatov legamra, you get credit. You are entitled to rejoice in the entirety of the mitzvah and the joy of the mitzvah. And he says not only that, but it says, if you look back in the Chumash, the very end of that paragraph, v'samachta b'chol hatov, it's pasuk Yud Aleph, verse 11. V'samachta b'chol hatov, you shall rejoice in all of the goodness that Hashem has given you to you, uleveisecha, in your household. Ata, you v'halevi v'hager asher b'kirbecha. Hashem says it's not only you, but if you do mitzvahs in that way, with enthusiasm, with joy, with appreciation, in a celebratory sense, like we said at the beginning, the way the Bikurim are brought with pomp and circumstance and joy and dancing, with music and accompaniment. If you do the mitzvahs that way, then you will rejoice, you and your household, all the members of your household. Halevi says, Kol hanilvi malech, all of those who accompany you, all of those who are in your coterie, those who are part of your circle, your friends and your neighbors and your co-workers, they will all be inspired by your example. Your example will motivate them and inspire them. And even the proselyte, maybe someone will be inspired to even embrace the Jewish faith. Not that we're evangelical in our orientation, but who knows, if a person lives his life the way he should, he can even inspire those from far away to appreciate and to desire and to seek and to yearn and to embrace the Torah way of life. This is what Alshikh says in his allegorical approach, which I think is very beautiful and inspiring to me. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Thank you to everyone. And we kept to the time tonight, which is a nice thing. And hope everyone has had a lovely holiday. And B'ezrat Hashem, we will be back next week. I have to say that the subsequent weeks we're here, but I would like to do a series on Yamim Noraim. I'm going to do Alshikh on Rosh Hashanah, Alshikh on Yom Kippur, and Alshikh on Sukkot. So next week is going to be Parsha. The subsequent 3 weeks, Thursday nights, we can do Thursday night just before Rosh Hashanah, etc. And we'll do that for the following 3 weeks. Also, just to mention, we've got